Welcome. Now I will explain the Dravorn timeline, which in picture you can see clearly how it is structured, how it began, what happened, and everything. So while I'm talking, you can discover things, see the timeline, etc. on the picture. I hope it is clear enough for you to understand. So let's begin. The Dravorn timeline begins with a disappearance, not a conquest. In M14 433, the Ark vessel Pandora's Promise vanishes from known history to the wider human galaxy. The ship is gone. It does not arrive at the colony. It does not reappear as a dead wreck. It does not become a famous relic of the Imperium. It simply disappears, swallowed into the black hole born pocket dimension that will later be known by the Dravorn as the Crucible. That is the first important point. The galaxy does not know that Dravorn survived. For everyone outside, Pandora's Promise becomes another lost vessel from the ancient past. Maybe a tragedy, maybe a forgotten record, maybe a name buried under thousands of years of worse disasters. But inside the crucible, survival continues. The people aboard do not become an empire. They do not become a crusade. They do not return immediately to tell Terra they lived. They are cut off from the universe, and that isolation becomes the foundation of everything that follows. The crucible is not just a hidden place, it becomes the hidden heart of Dragon civilization. A pocket dimension born from impossible conditions becomes their shelter, their prison, their laboratory, their home, and eventually their fortress. The Dragon developed in total secrecy for more than 16,000 years. That number matters. This is not a faction that found one powerful artifact and instantly becomes dangerous. This is a civilization that had time, pressure, survival need, and interrupted development. To understand deeply and more complex. During this hidden age, during these thousands of years, the Dragon became something the wider galaxy cannot properly categorize. They are human linked, machine linked, and crucible born. They develop under the guidance of Solus, the STC, and Forge Mind. But Solus STC is not treated as a slave, a machine spirit, or a god. Solus is a citizen and a founding mind. Erwook, the Draven Lord, becomes the moral root of the civilization, not because he is an emperor, but because he carries the final burden when no clean answer remains. This is where Draven identity forms. Their central law is simple. No one who carries the burden of survival may be reduced to property. That law shapes their society, their technology, their military doctrine, and later their treatment of Coralax. Coralax is an imperial world, or it was. The Dragon do not build themselves around conquest. They build themselves around survival, equality, shared purpose, and mutual reliance. From M14 to, to the early Horus heresy era, as you see per picture, the Dragon remain completely hidden from the wider universe. No public message is sent, no border is declared, no imperial record says, ah, Pandora's promise survived. To Terra, Mars, the legions, Xenos powers, and chaos, there is no Dragon faction. But this hidden does not mean asleep. By the time the Horus heresy begins, the Dragon already exists in secret. They had thousands upon thousands of years to develop inside the Crucible. Their technology, philosophy, and survival systems are already beyond what they were when Pandora's promise first vanished. This is the important timeline change. The Dravorn are not created after the heresy. They already exist before Istvan V. They are hidden, but they are real. The first hidden Dravorn action happens during the heresy era window around the flight of the Eisenstein. The Eisenstein is the warning ship. It carries loyalties trying to bring news of Horus' betrayal to the Terra. In normal history, the warning matters because the Imperium must know the rebellion is real. In the Draven timeline, Erwug intervenes in secret, not to rewrite the heresy, not to save the Imperium from itself, and not to reveal the Draven to the galaxy. He intervenes for one purpose: preservation. The dying warning must survive long enough to reach its destination. Recoverable loyalties must endure long enough for history to continue along its necessary path. Warp corruption and collapse are quietly suppressed in key moments. The Eisenstein remains the Eisenstein. Garo and the loyalties survivors remain the ones who carry the warnings. Dorn still receives the survivors. Terra still learns what must be learned. The Dragon do not take the credit. That's the entire point. The first hidden action is not a glorious arrival. It is not a fleet appearing from nowhere. It is not Erwug the Dragon Lord announcing himself to the Imperium. Oh, I am here! It is a hand in the dark, placed exactly where the history might otherwise die too early. This matters because it defines the Dragon better than any battle could. Their first act is not conquest. Their first act is not revelation. Their first act is not a domination. Their first act is but a restraint. They intervene only enough to keep the warning alive, they then vanish back into the silence. Nothing publicly changes. The Eisenstein still fulfills its role. Dorn still receives the warning. The heresy still unfolds. Easton 5 still happens in M31. Vulcan still enters the slaughters. The Dropside massacre still becomes one of the great wounds of the imperial history. The Draven do not prevent the heresy. They do not stop the betrayal. They do not erase the tragedy before it happens. That is deliberate. If the Draven openly intervened at that point, the entire timeline would break. Their existence would become a massive galactic variable too early. The Imperium would react, the Mechanicus would react, Chaos would react, the Primex would react. The heresy itself could become something completely different in itself, and not necessarily better. So the Dragon chose the narrowest possible action. Preserve the warning. Do not claim the event. Do not become the known. This creates a hard moral shape for the faction. They are powerful enough to intervene, but not too arrogant enough to assume every interference creates a better future. They can act, but they do not always have the right to act. They can save some, but they cannot save everyone. And in this heresy era, the cost of being known is too early, may be worse than the pain of remaining hidden. So the Eisenstein intervention, the Dragon disappear from history again. The galaxy moves on without knowing that they were actually there. The heresy burns, empires faction, legends die, myths are born, the Imperium survive, but in broken form. The Dravorn continues to develop inside the Crucible, hidden behind dimensional security, gate control, internal words, and a civilization built on survival rather than the worship or conquest. This is why the later M32 unveiling remained clear. The first hidden action happens before Eastern 5, but the first public Dravorn appearance still happens in M33. That distinction is critical. The Eisenstein intervention is not public history. It is a concealed correction known only to Dravorn and perhaps two fragments of memory, impossible impressions, or records no one can interpret. M32 is when the galaxy finally receives the data burst and learns that the Dravorn exists. In M32, the Dravorn takes Colorax, a former imperial feudal agricultural world, in turn it into a protected threshold world. This is their first public appearance. Colorax becomes sanctuary, embassy, recruitment ground, protected residence zone, diplomatic contact point, and suspended battlefield. The Dravorn declare their border and send the message outwards. We are here. These are our border. Colorax is open for speech. Cross with violence and you will be corrected. This is public. The Eisenstein was hidden. That separation keeps the timeline stable. The In M33, action shows that Airwook and the Dravorn civilization were already capable of precise intervention before the wider galaxy knew them. The M33 unveiling shows them when they finally decide secrecy can no longer be absolute. With this hand in the dark, the other side of the fence is becoming visible. The narrative meaning is simple but heavy. The Dravorn are not lost because they are weak. They are lost because the survival forced them outside the history. They are not hidden because they fear ordinary war. They are hidden because appearing too early would create consequences they cannot morally control. Their first hidden action proves their doctrine. They do not arrive to rule. They do not arrive to be worshipped. They do not arrive to be replaced. Imperium. They do not arrive only when silence would waste lives. And even then, they act with restraint. The Dravorn timeline is therefore built in three layers. First, the disappearance of Pandora's promise vanishes in M14433, and the galaxy believes it is gone. Second, the Hidden Age. The Dravorn survive and develop inside the Crucible for more than 16,000 years, unseen by the wider universe. Third, the split between the hidden action and public unveiling. Airbook secretly preserves the Eisenstein warning before the Eastern 5, but the Dravorn remains unknown until M33 Coralax unveiling. That is the core timeline. The Dravorn were lost to the universe. They were not dead. Their first act was not conquest history. Their first act was to make sure history survived long enough to continue. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you soon.